Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to do a video made up of some of the thoughts that I have, quite a lot actually. So as someone who really enjoys reading and who really enjoys lists and thinking about the things that she reads, I often think about the books that have had the biggest impact or the biggest influence on my life. Because I want to focus so much on fantasy with this booktube channel, that's one of the reasons that I made the channel. One of the goals I have for the channel is kind of catching up on all of that backlogged adult fantasy and seeing what's new being published right now in fantasy. I want to focus on the fantasy books that have had the biggest impact on the person that I am and have had the biggest impact on my life. I guess just due to the nature of a video like this, a lot of the books that had the biggest impact on me are books that I read when I was younger, either a child or a preteen, a teenager. And a lot of those books were fantasy books. Most of the books that I read back then were fantasy. So fantasy, whether or not I was tailoring this video to specifically focus on fantasy, fantasy is definitely the genre that has had the biggest impact on my life overall. But because I like to keep things focused and clear, I'm only going to talk about fantasy books today, and I want to talk about the books that I feel have had the biggest impact on me as a person. And the first one that I'm going to start with is actually a children's book. So this book is one of the earliest memories that I have, being read this book by my parents. Wanting to read this book, kind of bringing it to them over and over, is one of my earliest childhood memories. And that is Harold and the Purple Crayon. Harold and the Purple Crayon, for anyone who didn't read it as a kid or doesn't have kids of their own, is a story about a little boy who has a crayon, and with this crayon he sketches his own world. So it basically starts that he's going to go out for a walk, and as he goes for a walk he draws the things that he encounters. So it's essentially a story about imagination, about that open imagination of a child, about being able to believe that you can accomplish anything, being able to believe that you have so much will and you are able to impact your world in such a way, which I think is important for little kids for a variety of reasons. Young children don't have a lot of agency. Tantrums. If you've ever seen a kid being taken out of a toy store or a grocery store, you will recognize that kids have very little control over their overall environment. But in contrast, kids also have this huge ability to imagine a whole host of things that we as adults have totally cut off as possibilities. And this makes their minds just the most beautiful, most creative places. And I think that Harold and the Purple Crayon is the perfect children's book to introduce that sense of wonder and to make kids realize that they can be the masters of their own fate. They can create things. They can create a world that to them is the perfect place to be. And that is why I think that Harold and the Purple Crayon is such an amazing children's book. It's the first book that I read both my kids. It is a book that has had a profound impact on me throughout my entire life. I have multiple copies of it. I love it. I think that it is the best that Children's Lit has to offer. And so it is a book that I credit to influencing me in a major way and making imagination such an important part of my life, such an important part of who I am. So that is the first book that I can remember having such a huge impact on me, for sure. When we move a little bit further along, the next book that I can really remember changing my life in a profound way would be The Hobbit. So J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. And I mentioned this in a previous video, but my dad read me The Hobbit when I was about 5. So it was between age 5 and 6. And it was my first introduction, I guess, other than fairy tales and kids' books, imagination-fueled children's books, that was a fantasy novel. It was my first introduction to true, I guess you'd call it epic fantasy. People might argue the epic scope of The Hobbit, but it was my first introduction to real fantasy literature. And it had a huge impact on me. As I mentioned previously, I remember everything about reading the book. I remember how I felt at each of the chapters. I remember being completely mesmerized by the story. And it is at its heart a children's book. It is told in a series of adventures. The flow is a little bit less cohesive. You can see how it would appeal to children, because as Bilbo goes on his adventures, and each chapter kind of coincides with a different part of his adventure, and it makes it really appealing and really accessible for young kids. It's funny, the characters are a little more goofy than they are in the Lord of the Rings or other of Tolkien's works, and it works so well as an introduction to fantasy. I sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. It's the first time I can remember crying because of a book as well, so a lot of memories attached to this one, but it had a big impact on me, and then that influenced where I wanted to go from there. So whereas Harold and the Purple Crayon kind of set me up to look at the world in a certain way, The Hobbit gave me something to love. So it gave me fantasy lit, and it made me want to read anything and everything that I could in that genre. I was really sad when it was over, and then my dad told me that there were other books that didn't follow Bilbo but followed other hobbits, and so I was insistent that we were going to read The Lord of the Rings immediately. And when he told me that we couldn't because I was too little for it, I was furious. And I remember that night that I finished The Hobbit, I snuck out into my parents' room to my dad's bookshelf. I took down the copy of The Lord of the Rings and kind of opened it to the first page and was like, oh, he's right. I can't really read this on my own yet. But it gave me a goal to strive for, and I have also always been a very goal-oriented person. So who knows? Maybe my my interaction with The Hobbit also influenced me in that way. But where I couldn't go on and read the Lord of the Rings story on my own, my dad did pass on other works of fantasy that he felt would be more age appropriate. And this is where we come to the next book, or I guess it's really a combination of books that I want to talk about. And those books are White Fang and The Call of the Wild by Jack London. So those two books I read back to back. My dad had a bind up that had a bunch of his stories in it. And I read them one after the other. Whichever one's first in the bind up is the first one that I read, but I don't remember. And essentially White Fang follows a wolf in the wild, and The Call of the Wild follows a dog named Buck, who is abducted from his master's home and forced to go and work in the north. So I think he's a Saint Bernard, and he's a big dog, and he's forced to haul heavy loads on a dog sled. And so it follows both of those animals as they, make their way in the wild in the north. And I think these were really influential for me for a couple of reasons. So I grew up in Canada. I still live in Canada, but I grew up in a very cold climate that had long, harsh winters surrounded by a lot of forest. And so I really related to the setting in those novels. And I think that's part of what made them so memorable or made them stick so much for me. But one thing that I really liked about them was that they followed animals. So I know that anthropomorphized animals are not for everybody. Some, it seems to be very hit or miss. Some people really like them, some people really don't. But I have always been a huge fan of both animal characters, animal companions. If there's an animal in your fantasy book, I am usually okay with it, and I usually really like it. And I think that is in large part due to the influence that White Fang and The Call of the Wild had on me. Wolves especially. I recently started The Realm of the Elderlings, and I know a lot of people say that the first trilogy is the weakest or their least favorite, but I loved it. The fact that there is a wolf companion, that's almost the only thing that I needed. The books were fantastic in their own right, but I have had such a huge soft spot in my heart for animal companions, especially wolves, since I was a little kid, and that is in no small part due to the influence of Jack London. From there, the next book that I feel like was a huge influence on my development, I guess, as a person and as a reader, would be Watership Down. So Watership Down, I have long said, is my favorite book of all time. I read it, I think I was probably, I don't know, about seven years old when I read it. And I loved it for a lot of reasons. So as I mentioned, I love following animal characters. So Watership Down follows a group of rabbits as they have to leave their warren or their home because of the influence of humans, and they have to basically seek out a new place to live. And as they move across the English countryside, they encounter rabbits who have alternate ways of living. So they encounter a warren that lives, it seems, by the grace of humans, but there may be some kind of dark undertones. And then they also find a very militarized warren of rabbits that are kind of ruled by this dictator and live in fear. And so it's a fantastic book for lots of reasons. You know, it's an adventure story. It is the kind of exciting story that appeals to kids, but it also has a lot to say about people and about the way that people come together, how the ways that we live can influence the kind of people that we are, what kind of mark we leave in the world. The rabbits in the original party, who are kind of traveling across the countryside, have a host of personalities and strengths and weaknesses. And the people that rise to the top are not always, or the bunnies, the rabbits that rise to the top are not always the ones that you would expect. One of the things that I really loved about it is that it was one of the first times I could remember the hero, let's say, of the story not being someone who was the strongest. So the leader of these rabbits turns out to be, you know, not the strongest, and also not the smartest, and also not the fastest, but the person who can relate to others, the person who is brave, who can recognize the strengths in other people and use those strengths and use that perception to be a better leader, which is a great message for anyone, and especially a great message for kids. And it made me think a lot about what was heroic, what did I think was important. I had placed a lot of importance, even at a young age, on being smart and being the best. And one really important lesson of Watership Down was showing me that you don't have to be the best. You just have to recognize and be able to bring out the best in the people who are around you. And that was a lesson that stuck with me for a long time and had a big impact on me, even at that young age. Another thing that I really loved about Watership Down and became something that I appreciated in all fantasy novels moving forward was the formation of new words and a new vocabulary. So world building in fantasy is something that I would like to talk about in a future video, because people always mention, especially on book 2, people mention world building and the importance of world building. And world building is a huge topic. There are tons of ways that you can build a fantasy world, whether that's through your tone, through history, through interactions with characters, through, you know, specifically geography, the level of detail that you put into your stories. But one of the major things for me, and one of the things that I like the most about world building and that will make me feel most immersed in a story, is language. And Watership Down was probably the first fantasy book. There are words in The Hobbit that are not real words, obviously, words that J.R.R. Tolkien created, words that had not previously been in my vocabulary. But Watership Down was the first book that I read that kind of actively had a different system for the outside world and the world of the story. So the rabbits in the story have their own language, they have their own terms to refer to certain animals, to refer to certain states of mind, certain psychological changes, and I was fascinated by that. It really made me think about words and the development of language in a different way than I had previously. And language, how language comes into being, how language changes over time, those are things that I love thinking about. And I studied, before I went into medical school, I studied English and French and linguistics. So I do credit Watership Down for being one of the first sources of those topics that held such endless fascination for me. So it remains one of my favorite books of all time. I love it for lots of reasons. That is merely one of them, but it is most definitely one of the fantasy books that had the biggest impact on me. And then the next book that I felt really had a major impact on me was, of course, The Lord of the Rings. So I was about 10 when I read Lord of the Rings for the first time, and I read it obsessively for the next couple of years. I read those books so many times. I love them. It was totally different, obviously, than anything that I had read, including The Hobbit. I can't even describe what an impact those books had on me. They took me from someone who, really enjoyed fantasy into someone who would love fantasy books for the rest of her life. I loved the characters. I think that Lord of the Rings has a lot of really interesting things to say about friendship, about the nature of good and evil, about the choices that we make. Every time I go back and read it at different parts of my life, I see different things. So going back as someone who has a much better understanding and a much broader understanding of the human condition, of psychological pain, of addiction, I go back and I read it through that lens and I see something totally different than I did when I read it for the first time. And that is one of the things that makes it a classic. That's why it has had such an impact. That's why it's had such staying power. And it affects me in different ways now than it did then, but it certainly was one of the books that had a huge, huge impact on the type of reader that I am and the type of person that I became. It was my first dip into the world of fandom. I think it was like lotr.net or some like fan site. I was definitely a poetry contributor at that time. And I'm sure it would be really embarrassing to go back and read those now, but it changed my life forever. And that sounds really like big and dramatic to say, but it did. After The Lord of the Rings, I read, a bunch of other fantasy, none of which had the same kind of profound impact on me. But the next book that I can remember really having a big impact, and it's going to sound kind of funny after kind of the big epic fantasy that I just talked about, but it was a book that is called Flight of the Dragonkin by Susan Fletcher. It's this like old high fantasy for kids before YA fantasy was really a thing. I got it at the library at school because we were told, I think it was in grade 7 or 8, that we had to do a book report and we could go and pick something out. That had a dragon on the front and I was like, okay, this is it. I'm sold. This is the book that I'm reading. And the reason that it had such a big influence on me, or a big impact, is that it is the first fantasy novel that I ever read that really had a romantic subplot. And I was totally into it. I was like at the perfect age, that preteen time when you're just starting to have romantic feelings, or you're just starting to realize what romance is all about. And I remember being like surprised that this was in a fantasy book. I didn't think that those two things could come together. They didn't seem like things that would be hand in hand. I didn't go on to find a lot of books that that had both of those things, especially at that time. I was 13 a long time ago. To kind of expand on that point a little bit, another book that I read around the same time, so around the same age, 12, 13 years old, was Robin McKinley's The Hero and the Crown. It remains one of my favorite young adult fantasy novels. I think it encapsulates a lot of what can be really great about YA. I think it does a lot of things very well that don't happen as often in modern YA stories. And the reason that it had such a big impact on me is because the main character was a woman. And this hadn't been, up to that point, I hadn't read a lot of fantasy where the main character was a woman. And what's more than that is I hadn't really recognized or even thought about the fact that the characters that I was reading about weren't girls. It didn't ever occur to me. And it didn't ever occur to me to feel like I was missing out, to feel that I wasn't represented until I read this book. And it really opened up the realization that, a lot of these stories that I have loved and a lot of these books that have had a big impact on me, they don't have that many women in them. And when I read The Hero in the Crown, that followed a woman who was strong but also flawed, who had a story that was as rich and exciting as any of the stories that I had read before, it made me want more books like that. It made me intentionally seek out books that featured women in all kinds of roles. Women that didn't just serve as a vehicle to propel the other main character's story forward. And for that reason, it has really stuck with me. The next time that I can remember reading a book that really had a profound effect on me was when I read The Name of the Wind, or the Kingkiller Chronicles, in medical school. So I've mentioned a couple of times that I came from a fairly artsy background. I studied literature, language, that was my area of interest. There's a ton of reasons why I applied to med school, some of them good reasons, some of them not so good reasons. They are not the focus of this video. But what I can say is that when I got to medical school, it was difficult in the way that it is for a lot of people. You know, it's a big change in volume of learning, in pace. There's a lot to do. It's kind of all-encompassing. But it's a really strange experience. And I know I'm getting sidetracked, but it is relevant. It's weird because you go to university and you start to enjoy this level of freedom. When I went to medical school, your schedule, it's like you're back in high school. So your schedule is from 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening. You're with the same people every single day. You shuffle along from class to class together. Your attendance is taken. You're scrutinized in the same way. So it's just a different atmosphere. And I did not like it. As I mentioned before, and one of the reasons I wanted to start this channel is that I had moved away from reading fantasy at that time. I was still reading a lot, and I read, fiction and nonfiction, but I had moved away from fantasy. And then I found The Kingkiller Chronicles. I don't remember who told me to read it. I don't remember why I decided that this was the one giant book that I was going to get into, but somebody gave it to me, and I remember what a relief it was to go back and read something that I loved and something that could transport me to a different place and a different time. A lot of people that I've seen on BookTube talk about fantasy and talk about reading as an escape. And for me, that was never why I liked fantasy. I liked fantasy because it pushed the limits of your imagination. It made you see what the world could be. It helped introduce ideas in a totally new setting, but that were fundamental to the human experience. But when I read The Kingkiller Chronicles, when I read The Name of the Wind for the first time, that's what it was. It was an escape, and it was an appreciated escape because it came at the time of my life when I was undergoing the most stress, and it lightened the load. It was an amazing experience. I know it's not a book for everybody, but I loved it. It was all of the things that I loved about classic fantasy mixed with an appreciation for learning, for school, for, being interested in a variety of things, which I always had been, combined with Patrick Rothfuss's beautiful language, and it just came to me at the exact right time. Those are most of the books that have had a major influence on me, that have impacted the kind of fantasy reader that I am. I'm tempted to add the First Law trilogy onto that. The First Law was one of the first modern fantasy series that I picked up based on BookTube recommendations. It got me back into reading modern fantasy. It's kind of how I kicked off my reintroduction to modern fantasy, and it brought back that feeling of joy that I get when I get immersed in a new world, when I find a new fantasy book that I love so much. And so I think, if I'm reflecting back on this 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, I think that the First Law will definitely be added to this list. This is a topic that I think about a lot. This is something that I think is really important. It's important to reflect back on what you read and how it has impacted you and influenced you. There are non-fantasy books that I feel have had a big influence on me as well, and maybe some other time I will also talk about those. But for now, that's a rundown of some of the fantasy novels that have had the biggest impact on me, that have changed my life in various ways. And I would love to hear from anyone else to see what are the books, not necessarily your favorites. Not all of these are my favorite books. Not all of them I've gone back and revisited. But they are books for one reason or another that have had a huge impact on the type of reader that I am and the kind of person that I am. So I'd love to hear from any of you. Do you also like any of these books? Did they have a big influence on your life? Or which books did? And I will see you again, hopefully, with another video soon. Bye.